We decide how we're going to show up in the world as quite a young child, how we're going to be accepted, how we're going to be loved. And sometimes if we are too good at something, we get rejected. People don't like it if you're too good at something. And sometimes it takes something as life-changing as divorce for us to be able to go, actually, there's this whole side of me that I've kind of pushed away for fear of being rejected, for being too much. We don't know anymore what our roles are, because one thing that I need to do a lot of work with my clients is to bring them back into a more feminine energy. They've gone into a very masculine energy of having to be in control and of all those kinds of things. I think it's societal expectations, and it's bringing ourselves back to that more creative, that slightly softer energy. We actually come from a more compassionate place. We come from a gentler place where we allow things to flow a little bit more rather than thinking it has to be done a certain way. It has to be traditionally masculine way of approaching life.
Hey y'all, Josh Tomioni with the Derelict Podcast. Welcome back. We're so glad you're here. Would you do me a favor? It will only take you a couple seconds. Whether you're listening or watching right now, will you head on over to YouTube and hit that subscribe button? It really helps us get this message to more and more people that we can help. Greatly appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for being here and enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Derelict Podcast. For the disparaged, depleted, and delinquent souls trying to find our way, we're talking about the scary part of the journey, where we don't know how it'll end. Let's be free to face our fucking failures in real time as the most unadulterated, truest version of who we are. No sugarcoating. Welcome to the shit show, you derelict.
Hey there, you derelicts, and welcome to another episode of the Derelict Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Tomioni. As usual, we have a very special guest, Annabel Lane, here today. Annabel is a UK-based certified master Jungian life coach. That is a mouthful. We'll find out from her what that means. She's also a divorcee, like myself. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Her passion is empowering others to transform their lives after divorce. I relate to that. For sure. If you've been listening to the podcast at all, you know that I'm a divorcee, did not want to go through my divorce, and had to figure out what does version 2.0 of myself look like after that tragic event that I had to go through. So Annabelle went through the same thing, and her work combines a unique blend of Jungian psychology, that's Carl Jung, for those of you unfamiliar, neuroscience, and spirituality to help you uncover what's really keeping you stuck, lost, lonely, and then empower you to create a limitless and powerful next chapter. So with that, Annabel, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Josh. Really good to see you too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited for this conversation. So for those of you listening and watching, what I'm really excited about, Annabel and I connected actually online on social media of all places, probably because we both have feeds that have different divorcee stuff popping up, because it's the type of clients that both of us work with as people going through some sort of transition. I would assume maybe are a lot of yours also kind of midlife-ish like us as well going through this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the kind of work I do is much more suited to people who are going through it in midlife, that kind of self-reflection. Maybe we're not as interested to do that when we're in our, 20s and 30s, but when we're,
who wants to self-reflect when you're in your 20s?
Reflect and go, okay.
What do you need to self-reflect about in your 20s? Everything's perfect, right? You're Superman or Superwoman, and exactly. Everything's going well. All as my friend always says, all the parts of your body are in the right spot. Still, it's easy to make friends. It's easy to do whatever you want. I mean, trust me, as a single man dating again, if I end up dating younger women, it's always the same thing, because it's always like, well, I could just get whoever I want, so I'll do whoever I want, right? And then all of a sudden you reach your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, and it's like, maybe that's not the case anymore. Yeah. And, I think that there's a reason that the whole midlife crisis thing is a thing, right? Because something changes at some point. Don't know what it is. Something happens in that relationship. People decide they drift apart, or they just don't want to be married anymore, etc. So here's what we're going to talk about today, you guys. We're going to talk a little bit about Annabelle's work with divorcees. which I'm really interested in as well. I probably still need some work myself. I don't think I've arrived yet. I'll talk a little bit about the work that I do with the guys that I work with going through divorce and some of the things to pay attention to. And I think we're going to get into a little bit of our personal story. Does that sound good to you?
It sounds great. Looking forward to it.
All right. Fantastic. So do you want to maybe just start with kind of a brief, or how about this? So how long ago did you go through your divorce?
7 years ago. Well,
7 years
the
ago.
separation
Okay.
happened 7 years ago. The divorce has happened sort of after that. But yeah.
Okay. Got it. My separation happened 7 years ago as well. So wow,
Yeah,
we're almost
you're
on the
a very
exact same
similar timeline. Interesting.
Yeah, for me, it was literally as of the time of this recording, it was 7 years ago. We got separated 5 years ago. The divorce was finalized. So probably a similar timeline as far as that goes. And, with it, we don't need to go into all the gory details of why you got divorced. But one of the things that you said to me that I thought was really interesting right before is not that long ago, I had a gentleman on that actually was still married. And he talked a lot about his entrepreneurial journey and the different things that he learned just trying to keep his marriage together that he didn't do very well because he was so focused on his business and his career and where he was going in his life that a lot of the times his marriage, his spouse kind of got left behind. Mm-hmm. And you said you resonated with that a little bit because you were like the spouse.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So my ex-husband had a really great job and it made sense for me to stay at home. And I did stay at home. And it was something that I felt very grateful that I was able to do, to look after our kids, to bring up our kids. And it's worked really well to begin with. But I think what happened is we were living parallel lives, but just slightly started to go in opposite directions and just got further and further apart. And so as the kids started to get older, the relationship just got to a point where it had pretty much run its course because we were just living very, very separate lives. And so, it was really interesting listening to that previous episode and just hearing it from a different perspective, really. I think we're very lucky. We've created a good relationship now, myself and my ex. But it was very difficult for quite some time. And I felt very lost. I really felt very lost. And I'm sure he would have plenty to say on his part if he was being asked about it as well.
It's like we had the same experience going through our divorce, but a different experience, right? Like you were on one side of the divorce and I was on the other side of the divorce. It was almost like we got divorced, actually, as an example, because I was the person in the household that was out there running my career, trying to run my business, trying to do what I needed to do. And still, it's interesting. Actually, maybe let's talk a little bit about society's pressures right now for a second on people that are going through this or just people that are in this spot right now, because it's fascinating that, as a woman, there's a lot of pressure that is on women right now that maybe hasn't traditionally been on them, maybe in the past, in a more, call it traditional time, where somebody stayed home with the kids and that was what they were responsible for. And they stayed home with the kids and they cooked and they cleaned and they did the household. They were like the household manager, so to speak. And traditionally that was the woman back in the day. And then there's traditionally the man who had nothing to do with the household and was like the work manager and the money manager, right? The guy that went out and made the money and everything else and then came back to the house and did nothing. And now it's interesting that it seems like we're both just thrown into this muck of doing everything all at once, at all times. And from my experience, you talk to women and they're like, oh my God, there's so much pressure on us. And you talk to men, they're like, oh my God, there's so much pressure on us. I mean, it's the same way, right? Like, I'll just use an example. My dad never changed a diaper in his entire life, still to this day that I know of. And he's 85 years old. When I was raising my kids, when they were little in their diapers, I never would have even thought of not helping change diapers and get up in the middle of the night and do all of these things that men weren't expected to do. And frankly, I think the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it puts a lot of pressure on both men to do, let's even say, to bring out more of their feminine traits that might make them uncomfortable, and women to bring out more masculine traits that make them uncomfortable. And now all of a sudden you have two really uncomfortable people in the same house, stressed out of their mind, doing all these things that they have to do, and it's not helping, right? Can you speak to that at all as far as what you see with people going through this process or what you experienced yourself?
Well, in terms of my experience, I think we fell into a very traditional sort of pattern, almost. And it kind of surprises me because I don't think of myself as being a real sort of, I didn't know that I wanted to kind of recreate what my parents had had, but when I look back now, I see that we almost did. And I think it sounds terrible. It wasn't enough for me to just stay at home and be the mum and be the person who is prioritizing everybody else's needs, the person who was facilitating everybody else's lives and successes. Because I think I just had a sense that there was something more that I needed to do. I think I needed more mental stimulation, if I'm honest. I needed, don't get me wrong, being a mum will always be the first thing that I describe myself as being. I probably over-identify with being a mum.
You know what's interesting to me, Annabelle, is when I ask that question, what I notice is that immediately women almost get like defensive, like, no, don't get me wrong, I love being a mom. Like, yeah. Most women do love being a mom.
Yeah, there's a lot of guilt.
But it's just interesting that design has built in of like, oh man, I need to now define, like I need to be a little defensive and be like, no, I like being a mom. I know you like being a mom. I do. I just think it's really fascinating that there's just this idea, especially it happens with women a lot. It happens with men less, but it happens with women a lot of like, no, I like being a mom. We know you like being a mom, but there must have been something about kind of your mission or your purpose in life or what you really wanted to accomplish and how you wanted to do things that wasn't there. What do you feel like that was? What is being filled now within your spirit that wasn't back then?
I think it's a combination of things. Intellectually, retraining and doing the work that I now do fills a void that I think was there when I was putting everybody else's needs first and not really being that stimulated all the time, if I'm completely honest.
Yeah.
I think it's partly that, but also just creating something. I'm a really creative person. Yes, I created these people and I was ensuring that they were growing up to be, hopefully well-rounded individuals, but I needed something that was for me. And I think as a mum, and I'm interested to get your take on this, but as a mum, being selfless for me felt like that meant being a good mum. So it felt selfish in a way to need something for myself. And so, as awful as divorce is, it enabled me to sort of step outside of that role where I felt like my number one, and they will always be my number one priority. See, I'm still doing the defensive thing again, but to give myself permission to do what I needed for me and realizing that when I am fulfilled, I am a far better mum than when I am being a bit of a martyr almost. Doing a role 100%. That I think I'm supposed to do, but neglecting myself in the process.
100%. Absolutely. I had this conversation with somebody the other day. So I just looked up the definition of selfish. Okay. Selfish is lacking consideration for others, right? So it's narcissistic. It's totally egotistical. It's totally over the top. It's all about me, all about me, all about me, all about me, all about me. It's the phrase in our society is you do you. Right? Like just do whatever you are, whoever you are, do whatever you want. It doesn't really matter what happens to anybody else. So I get how you'd feel that way for sure, especially when you have these little humans, especially when kids are little. I mean, come on. Like, I have kids that the youngest is now just about to turn 8. So they're past this stage. But when they're 2 or 3, I mean, they can barely do anything, right? Like they're babies, they're toddlers. You're doing everything for them. It's really hard to feel like you're doing anything for yourself. And I'll tell you from my experience as the guy that was out of the house doing the work, I think it's part of the reason why guys, from my experience, the guys that I coach especially, I think it's part of the reason that the guys really focus on their work because it's something they feel like they're accomplishing. Like it's something that they're actually doing in the world. And it's something, and it could be good reasons or bad reasons. It could be obviously very selfish reasons for why they're doing that. But it also almost prevents anything of like, well, as long as I'm doing this, I think a lot of guys think like this, I'm providing for my family. I'm going out there, I'm doing this. That's kind of that traditional male model, let's say, right? Of, well, I'm going out, I'm providing for the family, I'm doing this. So everyone should be happy because of the fact that I'm doing all this stuff. So when I get home, you shouldn't need anything from me. I brought in money. I put food on the table. What else do you need from me? And I know from a guy's perspective in that role, and a lot of the guys that I talk with, sometimes that's really difficult because then when you get back and you try to be that guy that's engaged in everything else, it can often feel like everything you do is wrong.
Yeah.
Like, I'll just use an example. I've been an entrepreneur and a business owner all my life. And one of the beautiful things about being an entrepreneur and a business owner is you kind of do whatever you want to do. And you're the leader and you control what's kind of going on. Now, that being said, it comes with a lot of downsides and a lot of hurt and a lot of failure and a lot of difficulty and a lot of pain. But at least you kind of get to go do what you want to do. Then you come into a household where you have a household manager. Whether they're a good household manager or not is kind of immaterial, but you come into somebody else's world. Now, all of a sudden, as a business owner, entrepreneur with all the control, I just lost all my control the moment I walk in the door. And that can feel very disempowering for men. And men, I think, often don't know what to do with that. And it's not that they don't want to help or they don't want to be involved. It's just they don't know what to do with that. And if that is met with a traditional household manager, let's say, in this case, it would be as you, a woman.
Yeah.
If that is then met with all I've been doing all day long is helping everybody else, I haven't had fucking moment to myself. And that gets laid onto the person that also honestly feels the same way. Like he was just out working all day long, hasn't had a moment to himself either. Now you have two people that feel like they're not putting anything into themselves. And instead of coming together, at least from my experience, this is what happened. Instead of coming together as a team to like support each other and encourage each other and be there for each other, it clashes because it's like, no, I need my time. And the other person's like, no, I need my time. Right? It doesn't end well.
Got on, but I'm loving hearing this from your perspective because we get so ensconced, don't we, in our own narrative and our own version of the events. And it can be really, really hard to see it from the other person's perspective. I mean, I often think, having done the work that I've done and the training that I've done, I often think, I wonder how things would have been different, the dynamics in, my marriage, had I known what I know now, kind of thing. Not that I wish I could go back because I think, it's the right thing that we're not together now. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think, but would I have been able to hear what you've just said when I was back in that situation? Possibly not. You get so, into that headspace.
Yeah. And frankly, like you could take it the other way as well.
Yeah.
Right. Would I have been able to hear, I get home, I've been working hard, I've been beat down, people have been rejecting me, I've been failing all day long. Like I've always been in sales too. So I'm pretty much always getting told no from somebody at some point. Right. And I'm just getting kicked in the ass over and over and over and over again. And then I walk in the door and the very first thing I get, if I'm not getting love and respect and everything else, is I meet somebody that's just worn out and everything else, which is totally understandable. There's not like, I get why. And then I get met with like, well, you need to do this now. Like just, oh my God, like when does it end? Like, when do I actually be able to do something? Like there's a quote. There's a guy named John Eldredge who's written a lot of books over the years. And he wrote a book a long time ago called Wild at Heart. And he talks a lot about kind of the male psyche and soul just needing adventure and needing to to feel alive, right? Similar, I think, to how you just described as a woman needed to feel alive and not like you're just taking care of everybody else, but you need a mission, a purpose. And one of the things that he said is a man just won't be happy until he's got adventure in his work, in his love, and in his spiritual life. So I just picture myself a decade ago coming home when I didn't feel like I had adventure in my work. I just felt like work was kicking my ass all day long. I don't feel like I have adventure in my love because I come home to a spouse that's totally overwhelmed and stressed and everything else. And not that she's doing anything wrong whatsoever. She's just been with like little kids that are like farting and pooping and peeing and throwing up all over her all day long. Right. And then how do I take time right now at that point for either one of us to have any sort of a spiritual life? And it just beats you down. Right?
Yeah, it really does. It's, yeah, just talking to you about it now, because obviously my kids are a lot older now. Mine are 18 and 20. So that phase is a long time ago. But yeah, it's bringing it all back to me. It's a very stressful time. It looks, it can look to the outside world like you've got the perfect life, but everybody's feeling neglected and unseen and unheard. And yeah, it's a lot. It's a hell of a lot.
It's true. It's true. There's one other quote here that I'll read. Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. If you've read that, it's a fascinating read. If you haven't, I'd recommend it. This is what she said. She said, men weren't really the enemy, which, by the way, first of all, that's just interesting already coming from her, because this is kind of the founder of the feminist movement, right? Men weren't really the enemy. They were fellow victims suffering from an outmoded masculine mystique that made them feel unnecessarily inadequate when there were no bears to kill, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah.
Because again, man needs this purpose, right? Like back in the day, it was really easy as a caveman. You went out, you killed the animal, you brought it back. It was very easy for the woman. She stayed in the cave and protected the kids. Neither one was better or worse. They were not equal though. This equal bullshit is just bullshit because it's different. Right? Like the woman is there making sure that the kids are okay and also protecting the children. She's the mama bear, right? She's making sure that the kids are okay while the guy's out there killing the animal to bring back to feed everybody to make sure that they're okay. It's a different way of taking care of people. And we're in this mode right now, it seems like, and I don't know if it's shifting at all or not again, but we're in this mode where there's so much pressure on men and women to do both of those roles that it's just not working. Somebody said to me the other day, they're like, well, but divorce rates are going down. Well, the only reason divorce rates are going down is because people aren't getting married.
Yeah.
That's it. Partnerships are still breaking up. It's just that people aren't getting married because a lot of people are thinking, what's the advantage of getting married? So I get married, I sign everything over to my spouse, and then they get divorced and they take half of my stuff and more. And I'm in a worse situation financially. Why would I do that? What's the benefit there?
It's interesting you say this about we don't know anymore what our roles are, because one thing that I find that I need to do a lot of work with my clients is to bring them back into a more feminine energy. They've gone into a very masculine energy of having to be in control and of all those kinds of things. And I think, I'm not saying it's divorce that's necessarily done it. I think it's societal expectations, and it's bringing ourselves back to that more creative, that slightly softer energy. Not that we don't do things, we do things, but we actually come from a more compassionate place. We come from a gentler place where we allow things to flow a little bit more rather than thinking it has to be done a certain way. It has to be that very traditionally masculine way of approaching life. And that is something that I see over and over again. All the women that I work with, we need to bring them back into a more feminine energy.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And, we talk about this on this podcast somewhat often. Every female has feminine and masculine energy. Every male has masculine and feminine energy. And the majority of women have mainly feminine energy and the majority of men have mainly masculine energy. So we're not talking about the outliers here because there are outliers. But this is even true in same-sex couples. If there's two women in a couple, you will find one with mainly feminine energy and one with mainly masculine energy if the relationship's going to work. If it's not going to work, you're going to find one of either of the other ones and it's not going to work. Guaranteed. It just won't work. Same thing with male-male couples. Same thing. One is going to have more primarily masculine energy, one more primarily feminine energy because the energies come together. And if you have too much of either one, it doesn't work. And Tony Robbins says, and I agree with him for sure. Tony Robbins says, feminine energy grows with praise and masculine energy grows with challenge. I'll say that one more time. Does that beep on your end or my end? It keeps beeping. Do you have mail open or something?
I don't see. I
don't think it's on my end.
How do I? I don't even know how to. Sorry.
It's okay. Are you on a Mac?
Let me just completely close. I thought it was closed down anyway, but hang on.
If you see your little apps on the bottom of the screen?
Yeah. There's no.
If you see a dot underneath it, it means it's open.
Right. It's definitely. Well, I've definitely closed it down again. So
weird. Okay. It's all right. I'm just going to repeat that again because I like that quote.
Yeah. No, it's a good quote.
So Tony Robbins says that feminine energy grows with praise and masculine energy grows with challenge. I agree with this. And I'll fall on my sword a bit here. I know one of the mistakes I made in my marriage, and not just my marriage, also in romantic relationships with girlfriends, partners, even relationships with friends who are women, is that because I know that my energy grows with challenge, I then project that onto someone else.
Yeah.
And I know when in my marriage, one of the things that I did wrong that did not help our marriage flourish, it did the opposite, was that I would challenge my wife thinking that that was going to help her feminine energy grow. And in reality, it did the opposite. It grew her masculine energy. And then the more a woman who's primarily feminine, which my wife was, the more a woman that's primarily feminine grows in her masculine energy, the more it's almost impossible for that person not to have any sort of bitterness or resentment or anger towards the person that is making that grow within them. And then at the same time, my feminine energy was growing. I used to be a codependent. I just was trying to make peace, just wanted everything to be okay so that you're okay, so everybody's okay, etc. Didn't want to rock the boat, etc., which actually ended up rocking the boat more than if I wouldn't have done that. So you have a man as his feminine energy is growing and a woman whose masculine energy is growing. And now all of a sudden, both of them start feeling really uncomfortable in their own skin because they're not being themselves. And at a certain point, there's got to be a tipping point there. And if one of those people realizes, oh, I don't want to live like this anymore. I'm a man, I want my masculine energy. I'm a woman, I want my feminine energy. Well, that doesn't work real well if the other person doesn't see it. And I think it's the same thing that's true with women. This has been my experience with the guys that I've coached, is a lot of the time where guys are just done with relationships or they want to move on or they just can't figure out why there's not any spark there anymore is because their partner is just not challenging them anymore. It's the woman who's constantly praising somebody. This happened actually a lot in my past relationship. I was with this woman for almost 2 years. And at the beginning of the relationship, one of the reasons I loved it so much is there was so much challenge, like good challenge, not bad challenge. There's just so much challenge. She just would not take shit from me. And I loved it because my masculine energy just grew and grew and grew. And all of a sudden I just felt like, oh, just like, yeah, I can take on the world. Right. And then something shifted where it was just praise and there wasn't any challenge anymore. And then all of a sudden I'm getting bored and I'm sitting around and I'm like, what is going on? I'm not liking this anymore. And same vice versa. At the beginning, I was really good about, like you are with every relationship, right? You dote on the praise and you dote on the person and you date them and you send them flowers and you do all the things, right? And then all of a sudden at some point in the relationship, you're like, it just becomes about a challenge. Like, what are you doing? No, do this, do this. Do this, do this, do this. And then all of a sudden, this woman's only getting challenged. And me as a man, I'm only getting praise. And that only goes so far. And after a while, you get tired of it. And then it's just like, all right, I'm over it now, I guess.
So I find this quite interesting because you would think that praising somebody would always be received in a positive way, wouldn't you?
Which is also interesting for you to say as a woman, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm coming from that energy, aren't I? So so I'm finding this, looking at it from this perspective, quite fascinating because we think we're doing something really good, but actually it's something that's really good for us, not the other person. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it doesn't mean that women don't want to be challenged and men don't want to be praised. Obviously that's true. But that's not how the energy grows. So if all of a sudden the energy doesn't grow and there's not that polarity anymore, the spark goes away. And, it's like the people that say, I just don't understand what happened to the spark. Well, what happened to the spark is you're not pursuing her feminine energy and she's not pursuing your masculine energy. You're not pursuing that within each other. So therefore it gets boring, right? You hear the word like, well, I'm bored or there's no spark or I don't understand. There's no passion or, it's these incredibly sad examples that I hear of sexless marriages or where there's just no intimacy. There's no spark. Because there's no energy that's being sparked by the other person. And
I think polarity is the key thing here. And it's something that is not talked about enough. We grew up, myself growing up, having a really good education. When I think back to my education, it was like, go and show the boys that you're just as good as they are. It was never about working with your feminine energy. It was all about, no, go. And so you're constantly dumbing down what is naturally at the core of us to try and become something that we thought we needed to be in order to be able to compete and be on a level playing field. And the whole idea of polarity was just thrown out of the window. And I think it's so important to come back to this. And, there was so much perception that, femininity was linked with being softer, with potentially being slightly weaker. It's not. It's such a powerful energy when it's used correctly. And I think, there's so much that we can learn from that and take going forwards. Yeah, it's a really important point.
It's a different type of powerful, right? Yeah. Like I was having this conversation with someone the other day where I think personally, feminine energy is the most powerful energy in the world. And here's the reason why. You take masculine, strong energy of challenge and conquering and confidence and all the different things that are involved in masculine energy, and you look throughout history. Well, where has a lot of it come from? A lot of it has come from either fighting over a woman who has very strong feminine energy, as an example, Helen of Troy or whoever you want to fill in that blank. But most wars, most big issues, most ways that guys have just gone like this have been because of a woman. And they've been because of it's never been a woman with strong masculine energy. Not once.
No.
Read the history books. It's always been a woman with extremely strong feminine energy that brings out that masculine energy from that man. And if we go back to traditional roles for a second, I think it's very easy. And I think a lot of what's happened over society over the last several decades that's been really difficult for women is that in general, the workplace is filled with very masculine energy, not a lot of feminine energy. I still speak to my female friends and women that I coach that are like, I just don't even know how to bring my feminine energy to work. I just don't even know how to do it because it's such a masculine model. Here's the thing on the flip side that I don't hear about as much, but I think is just as true. There's also a lot of men that don't know how to bring their masculine energy into the home.
Yeah.
Where it seems like the home is this place of growth and nurturing and development and praise and all these beautiful feminine traits. How does a man now bring his confidence and courageousness and challenge into that home without just disrupting the apple cart? Same with the woman trying to bring that into work. So now you have a man who basically drops his masculine energy at the door to just try to appease what's going on in the home. You have a woman who's dropping her feminine energy at the door when she goes into work to try to appease what's happening in career. And both of them are miserable.
Yeah.
So they get in bed at night. They're both miserable. They're both not living their full energies. We all know what's going to happen there.
Yeah, not very much.
Yeah. So now I guess being on the other side of it, especially because you help so many people live this better life, especially after they go through this transition. Like for some of us, it's too late. Like I can't do anything to save my marriage. I've been divorced for several years. Same for you. Frankly, for me, it was a good thing. Glad I'm divorced now. Didn't want to be at the time. Thought it was the worst thing that was ever going to happen to me in my life. But honestly, ended up being the best thing that's ever happened to me because it grew me to the person that I am today. So I'm incredibly grateful for it, even though I wouldn't want it on my worst enemy. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible experience to have to go through. But now being on the other side of it, or maybe even just speaking to the people that are listening to this that aren't on the other side of it yet, or maybe are going to be on the other side of it, what sort of hope or inspiration can you give them when we're talking about kind of these energies and manifesting their authentic self? Like, how do you work with people to do that?
So I get them to get really honest with what they're aware of, where they are right now. And that's the kind of things, you know, when you're awake at 2 a.m, when you're going through a divorce and all your worst fears are coming to the surface, we get brutally honest. What do you really think about your situation right now? What is the story you're telling yourself about what's possible for you, what's not? Then we look at where you want to be. And we think so often it's what we're aware of that's standing in our way, but actually it's not. And this is where the Jungian psychology piece comes in. You know, it's what's in the unconscious mind, the things we're not allowing ourselves to be, the things we rejected about ourselves by the age of 5 or 7 that are actually running the show. There's a famous quote by Carl Jung that says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So you see these people who they've been through a horrible divorce. There was a really, difficult dynamic in their relationship. They know they've identified that now. They've seen what happened and they're like, that's not what I want. And then they repeat the same pattern over and over again because the unconscious mind, which makes up 95% of the total mind, is actually running the show. It's directing us without us realizing because we're hardwired to go for what's familiar. So the work that I do with people is to help them identify what's really standing in their way, what's stopping them from creating the life that they really, truly crave. It's about becoming like the fullest version of yourself rather than just this quite narrow version. That can be hard to hear, a narrow version. We don't think we're a narrow version of ourselves, but there's so much more to us that's possible. And I'm not saying you become everything that you've not allowed yourself to be, but just knowing every time you've got a choice to make or you're in a situation, you go, am I just making a choice from my old conditioning, or do I want to make it from the fullest version of myself that I can actually become? And this is when it gets really exciting for me, because then this is when people can step into something, a whole new version of themselves. When I got divorced.
Can I back you up for a second?
Yeah.
Because that was a really good question. I'm curious how somebody comes up with the answer of that. So if somebody sits there and they're like, hey, is this action or this way that I'm acting from the old programmed version of myself, or is this how I actually want to be? How do you know the answer to that? Like, what are there any tips that you can think of when you're asking that question?
One way that you can work out what is in your shadow self, so anything that's in the unconscious mind is classed as being the shadow in terms of Jungian psychology. When you notice yourself getting really triggered by somebody else's behavior, the chances are that is probably a trait that you've pushed into your shadow. It's something you don't allow yourself to be. So the fact that they are showing up in a way that you've never realized you don't allow yourself to be, that is usually a sign that that is in your shadow. That's just a simple way. So that's, and so if I was working with somebody and they would come in and they'd go, oh, so annoyed, maybe in the process of divorce, so frustrated with their ex or soon to be ex because of X, Y, or Z, we'd look at, okay, well, what kind of person behaves like that? How would you describe that kind of a person? And then you look at the way they describe themselves in a similar situation, and usually they are poles apart. Say we go back to that more traditional sort of the mum being at home and putting everybody else's needs first, or the way as I said, I was in a lot of my marriage. If I saw somebody doing something that I perceived as being selfish, that would probably really trigger me, because that's something that it's within me, but I don't allow it to be at the forefront. So that is that's just one way that you can start to identify what's in your shadow. But what we do as part of like Jungian coaching is not that you swap one for the other. You don't go from being relatively selfless to suddenly being selfish. It's knowing that that is part of you, and how can you allow elements of that to come in? So it's integrating the two, what they call individuation. So yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I love the fact that you brought up triggers as well. Let's talk about that for a second, because we live in a society where everybody gets triggered over everything at all times.
Quite a phrase, isn't it?
Well, the thing about triggers is very, very simple. If you say that something anybody else did triggered you, and you're requiring that person not to say that anymore, that means that you are a victim to what anyone else says, and you're not in control of your own life.
Exactly.
And this is what people don't understand when they go out with their triggers and they say, well, you can't say all these different things because they triggered me. Well, if you want to live your life like that, go for it. You're going to be a victim your entire life. You're never going to be in control of anything that you want to do. You're not going to have any power. You're not going to have any control. You're not going to be able to manifest anything in your own life. You're not going to be able to manifest your destiny. You're not going to get where you want to go. It's just not going to be possible, because you're constantly dependent on somebody else acting in a certain way, which I think very much relates to divorce and marriage as well. Because what I've learned is that if somebody else triggers me, what I need to focus on more, instead of getting them to change the trigger, is what inside of me is being triggered.
Exactly.
And what's more important, if I want to be a victor in this life, is to get it so that it doesn't trigger me. Because if it doesn't trigger me, then I'm unaffected. And if I'm unaffected, I can continue to live my mission and my passion and my purpose on this planet. So I love the fact that you brought up triggers, because I think that this is a very easy excuse within a relationship or a marriage to say, well, that person always does this and they trigger me. And maybe they don't even use the word trigger, but they're like, well, this person is always this way. Yeah. It's like the people that say, well, men are always like this and women are always like this. Well, no, they're not. There is no man that's always like this. There's no woman that's always like this. It's just not the way things work, right? Maybe collectively a little bit as a majority, but no, there is no one thing that is always true. And if I'm constantly looking at somebody else to change, I'm never going to be able to be the person that I want to be anyway. And I think the thing that I really try to encourage the guys that I coach with as much as possible is that there's only a couple things that you can control. And number one, what you can control is what's going on inside of you and who you are and what's triggering you. So worry less about what she's doing and worry more about the fact of why it's bothering you.
Yeah.
Why you got defensive over that, why you got angry over that, why you feel hurt over that. Deal with that. And if that doesn't pop up again, you can be sure you can be the absolute best possible person that you want to be. And you can grow into the best version 2.0 of yourself. And you're going to find one of two things if you do this. And this is true for men or women. If you get to a point where none of that stuff is bothering you anymore and you're living your most authentic, masculine, feminine, etc. life, the person that you're in relationship with is either going to be very attracted by that or very repelled by that.
Yeah.
And the thing that I've learned in my life, as much as I didn't want to admit it back when I was in my marriage, is that whether they attracted or repelled by that, they're both good options. Because if I'm living my most authentic life and I find that somebody's really attracted to that, great, we're going to have a great relationship. If I'm living my most authentic life and I find that somebody's really repelled by that, great. Time to find somebody else.
Yeah.
There's 8 billion people on the planet. Don't get stuck with the one that's repelled by you being you.
Yeah, I think there's so much of us just playing roles, almost wearing like the persona. It's a bit of a mask that we wear. We think it's what makes us acceptable, what makes us lovable. And actually, there's so much more to us than that. And sometimes it's not always what we consider to be the bad stuff either. We can have what's called the golden shadow. It can be like shining too brightly, all these kinds of things. So yeah, I think I just find all this inner work fascinating.
Talk about the golden shadow. I'm unfamiliar with that concept. What's that?
So that's where, if you think about, we decide how we're going to show up in the world as quite a young child, how we're going to be accepted, how we're going to be loved. So essentially our conditioning. And sometimes if we are too good at something, we get rejected. People don't like it if you're too good at something. And so sometimes it's our brilliance that gets pushed into the shadow. Don't be too much. Don't be too confident. Don't be too good at this. Don't be too good at that. And so sometimes people think the shadow is maybe all negative stuff. And it's not. It's a lot of it can be really good stuff as well. And sometimes it takes something as life-changing as divorce for us to be able to go, actually, there's this whole side of me that I've kind of pushed away for fear of being rejected, for being too much, too this, too that, too the other, whatever it is. And it gives you this opportunity. So when you were asking before, like, if somebody's really struggling, what hope can you give them kind of thing? It's like, if me 7 years ago could see me doing this now, I think she'd be quite amazed, because the version of me 7 years ago was so lost. I felt like I'd lost my purpose. I didn't really know what my identity was outside of being a mum and a wife. And it was like, oh my God. And so the work that I've done on myself has enabled me to really look at what was in my shadow. Some of the less shiny bits, but also some of the really shiny bits that I felt that people didn't like me expressing too much when I was little, So it's a great opportunity to learn about ourselves and just really show up fully. And it's so exciting.
I love that. So, because it's so true. It's so true. If you are living your most authentic self and you let your light shine, that is going to attract the people that you want to attract.
Yeah.
And it's also going to blind the people you want to blind.
Yeah.
So be it.
Piss off a lot of people.
Absolutely it is. I mean, here's a really good example of this. People that are financially successful, and I will say people that are much more financially successful than me. I'm financially successful. It's all a range, right? Mm-hmm. But people that are extremely financially successful, take millionaires or even billionaires. If you watch how society responds to them, there will almost always be two camps. Mm-hmm. There are the people that are out there, and let's just say that in general, they're doing good in the world. Let's just assume that for a moment. There will be a cohort of people that are cheering them on, that are like, that's amazing. They get inspired by that. They want to go be like that person. They're like, look at that. And then there's always going to be a cohort of people that get triggered, that are offended by the fact that they even have money and that they've had success, even though all they did was work really hard and did everything that they could to try to make that money in, let's say, good ways. Because again, this goes back to, well, what's the trigger? So like what's driving my response? And I have to often ask myself this, because here's the deal. So I'm finishing up a book right now that's going to be out here pretty soon, maybe out by the time this podcast gets out. We'll see. But one of the stories that I'm actually going over again right now that I'm re-editing is this idea that sometimes, and it makes me feel like a terrible person, honestly, and I'll just say it out loud anyway. Sometimes when my friends or even close people, family, etc., have success, I get really jealous of them and I don't want them to have success, because it's like they're leaving my atmosphere. And they're like, I don't want you to leave my atmosphere. Stay back down in my atmosphere. My core wants the absolute best for them and wants to have the most financial success and most life and love and everything else. But then there's an insecure part of me that gets triggered that I haven't dealt with so far, that I'm like, no, I don't want you to have love. I don't want you to have life. I don't want you to have money. What the hell if I don't have those things? And we can easily do that in relationships as well, right? I remember this guy telling me a long time ago, right when I was about to get divorced, he said, even when I fill out paperwork, I never say that I'm divorced. And I said, why is that? He said, because it's an identity. My identity is not failed marriage. Because every time you say you're divorced, your entire identity is, I failed ultimately at my marriage that was supposed to stay together forever. He said, that's not my identity. I have been divorced. I was married. I'm no longer married, but that's not my identity. That's not who I am as a person.
Yeah.
I am me. That's who I am as a person. And these subtle ways that we think about things or these ideas about money when we're talking about success, they influence the way that we treat these other people. And all they do is it's like drinking our own poison, right?
Yeah.
Like we're not hurting anybody else in that. We're just hurting the other person. We're just hurting ourselves. We're not hurting the other person. That person that has all that financial success, we're not hurting them by being jealous and resentful and angry and everything else that they have this success. All we're doing is limiting our own chances of doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things that have really come up for me there. That whole identifying as being divorced. I feel like for me, I only realized this more recently, but I realized I'd split my life into two parts: pre-divorce, even though there were lots of different elements to my pre-divorce life, and post-divorce. And it's only in the last year or two that I've finally stopped, although obviously I am a divorce coach and we're talking about divorce here. I realized that that is not my most identifying trait anymore. I think when you're really in the heart, you're consumed by it, that is the first thing that you identify as, I'm divorced. And so it's really interesting that guy was saying that, because I think you've got to get to a point where you've worked with yourself enough to let go of any shame, any feelings of, okay, the marriage failed doesn't mean that I'm a failure necessarily, or that the other party's a failure. Maybe it worked. It was there for as long as it was supposed to be ultimately. So I think it's really interesting to get to a point. That's where I love my clients to get to a point where they realize that they're so much more than a divorcee. And what was the other point I was going to say? Sorry, I've gone off. It's a bit of a tangent now. I know what it was. It was about money, right. Actually, because going back to what I was saying about the shadow, when I work with people around money mentality, and I find that that's something that a lot of women need to work on, because particularly if they've been a stay-at-home mum and they're not feeling particularly financially viable, they can have a lot of hang-ups. I think we all have hang-ups about money anyway. But when I work with people around their money shadow, it can be like a double-ended shadow. We don't want to have too much because there's too much responsibility, or there's all sorts of stories around the fact that it's greedy, it's not good, it's unfair to other people if you're too successful. But also the other shadow is we're terrified of not having anything. And so we keep ourselves in this sort of like comfortable middle point. Okay, this is an acceptable place to be, but we're not going to go for our big dreams because people won't like us. It's again, the shining too brightly, that kind of thing again. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's so true. And just a real quick comment that you brought up on failure and shame, right? I think a lot of people have a hard time with even the word failure, because let me even go back to divorce as an example. Mm-hmm. Divorce, I think by definition, is just failed marriage, right? I don't even know what the definition of divorce is, but let's just say it's a failed marriage. Mm-hmm. Well, that feels ultimate and that feels shaming. That feels like, oh man, I'm a bad person. As a reminder, shame means I'm a bad person, right? It's not like guilt, like I did something bad. Shame is I'm a bad person. But here's the thing with failure. Failure is not ultimate. In fact, if you look up the definition of failure, all it is lack of success. Or another way of saying it, I love the second definition of failure. The second definition of failure is the omission of expected or required action. So failure is the omission of expected or required action. Nothing about that definition is ultimate. Nothing whatsoever. It just means that there was something that was expected that didn't happen. Mm. There was something that was required that didn't happen. So again, if you talk about a failed marriage, well, the only reason it's failed is because the marriage was expected to last forever. Yeah. Now, I don't know why anyone has that expectation anymore with the amount of marriages that last forever. First of all, there is no marriage that lasts forever because it has to have a starting point and an ending point, even if it's death. So there is no forever marriage. So just getting this idea out of our head, maybe that marriage should be forever, might be the first step. Maybe we should just get rid of that altogether. Maybe we shouldn't expect that, because to me, that's 100% chance that you're going to fail, that it's not going to be expected. It doesn't mean that you don't hope for a nice, long lasting marriage. I'm not a cynic like that. I'm not saying don't get married. I'm not saying don't have that expectation or that hope, of course, but don't have the expectation that's so big that you can't keep it, because then that's when failure turns into shame. But if failure is just, I expected to do something and it didn't happen, then I fail every day. Don't you?
Yeah. But then it just goes to show how the way that marriage has gone about, if you think about, well, I don't know what it's like in the States, but in the UK, if you think about the average marriage vows, especially in a church, it's like till death do us part, that kind of thing. So it's like you are making a commitment, and obviously not everybody gets married in a church, but it's for the rest of your life. That is what you are agreeing to in front of all those people. So, maybe there's room for maneuver in a big way. I mean, I know everyone can write their own vows, but that's the traditional way.
But I agree with you. Absolutely. Because how many people have said those words and didn't keep that commitment?
A lot.
So either don't. Yeah, right. Well, even higher, like I said, because of the fact that if you include people that didn't get married, here's the thing. Either don't say the words or mean them and actually stick with it. One or the other. I don't know why that concept is so novel in our world today with pretty much any concept at all. If you're going to say the words, just stick to the words. So if you're not going to commit that after your spouse cheats on you, beats you, does whatever they need to do to you, that you're going to stick with them, then don't say those words, because that's unfair, right? Don't say the words. There's no clause in there that says, well, until death do us part, unless, and then there's 50 items listed, like unless you get fat, unless like you lose your hair, unless you beat me, unless you cheat on me with my best friend. Like there's no list of 50 different things. So then don't say the words. Mean what you say what you mean. So that being said, Annabel, I know we got to wrap up here. This has been a really good conversation. Thank you so much. We went all over the board, but I think we had a lot of good conversation about people going through divorce, some things to consider, everything from shame to failure to becoming the next version of themselves. I want to end because I want to make sure that people know how to get a hold of you. Okay. So I will write this in the show notes as well, but what's the best way to get a hold of you? And is there anything that you'd like to offer just to people listening?
Okay. So people can, if they're on Instagram, I am Annabel Lane, but you're going to put it in the show notes. There's various ways to spell Annabel, aren't there? Or my website, annabellane.com. And what I offer is a free 30-minute coaching session with people to explore this further, so they get a taste of, the methodology that I use to help people move forwards, and see if it's a good fit for them and if they want to pursue that further. So, yeah. That's
fantastic. Thank you so much. And I know, I'll do that with some clients as well, or some potential people. And I know that your time is very valuable. So I really appreciate you offering that. I don't think a lot of people hear that and they're like, oh, well, she's just having a call with me. No. Every call she has with you is a call she doesn't have with somebody else that she should be charging for, because that's how coaches get paid. So that's a really big deal. And I really appreciate that offer very much. So in the show notes, go check it out right now, whether you're on Spotify, YouTube, wherever. There's going to be a link to Annabel's Instagram, and then also a link to her free coaching call that she's offering. Thank you very much for doing that. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. And thanks so much for your time. I've really loved this conversation. It's always interesting to hear another perspective. I work predominantly with women at the moment, but it's always good to get the male perspective as well. So make it all a more rounded conversation. So yeah, it's great. Really
I appreciate that as well. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast, because I work with mainly men, you work with mainly women. Yeah. So I thought that would be an interesting perspective. So thank you very much. I know it meant a lot to the listeners. So thank you all for listening to another episode of the Derelict Podcast. Appreciate you all. As a reminder, like, subscribe, send this to a friend that you think needs to hear this today. Send it to somebody maybe going through this process, or you think might go through this process soon. I think it should be encouraging for them, very much so. So thanks again. Until next time, we'll see you later, you derelicts.